I don't often get to introduce somebody with the. I feel like almost feel like I'm inducing, and I hate to say it, that for the Joan Didion educational series, but I have to tell you that you know how much respect and time I've spent on Joan Didion in my life, and I will tell you that Kathryn is a unique, very extraordinary author who has a very similar style in terms of the depth of what I would call the laser beam insight in the way that she sees the world and the way that she has written about it in an amazing way about the area that we live in and the influence of that on this nation on a very profound and meaningful way. What you're going to hear about tonight, which was from the 1935, but more importantly, it's part of a bigger book right out of California, and another book she wrote of the newspaper axis that feels very similar to the environment we're living in today in America and right now in California. So I'm excited about having Kathryn here because she is part of the fabric that makes Sacramento different than any other place on the planet, in my opinion, where we get to live in an environment with an extremely enlightened and group of people around us, and that leads us differently than the rest of the country, which is why they hate us so much. But they also know that this is where the world constantly changes and is leading the way and figuring it out way in front of everybody else. And one of those people who has been doing that with her life is Kathryn Olmsted. She's in her 20th year as a professor at UC Davis, has written 5 books and a whole series of aspects of those books and chapters and articles and things like that, like the title of this period tonight of the great Sacramento conspiracy trial. And so I am honored to have her here speaking to us because of her works, which are so significant for the history of this area and for the 30s and what the 30s were like in Sacramento and California and the nation. So it's my honor to introduce Kathryn Olmsted, professor, from my perspective. She wants to just be introduced as the history teacher, but professor and author Kathryn Olmsted. Thank you. Oh yeah, you're on. Sorry.
Wow. All right, well, thank you for that extremely generous introduction, Greg. And I would also like to thank everyone else who helped me to come here tonight and arranged everything, including Tony and Delta, and thanks to the AV crew here. And thank you all for coming. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you this evening. So I'm going to tell a story tonight. It is from 1935. And it comes from my book, which is called Right Out of California, the 1930s and the Big Business Roots of Modern Conservatism. And so this story of the Sacramento conspiracy trial is one of the stories that I tell in the book. This story was quite well known at the time, but I think it has been lost to Sacramento history. It was at the time the longest trial in California history up to that point, and also the largest in terms of the number of defendants. 19 people initially, ultimately 14 people, were tried for the crime of conspiracy to commit criminal syndicalism, which meant in brief that they belonged to an organization that the state of California had outlawed, the Communist Party. They were all farm worker union organizers. And what I want to do tonight is talk about, first of all, the background of what was happening in California agriculture at that time. And then I want to talk about the biggest agricultural strike in US history, which happened in the Central Valley in 1933. And then I want to talk about how that led to this mass trial of these farm worker union organizers. And then I want to talk about why it matters today. But let me begin by talking a little bit about the background of California farmland and farm labor in the 1930s. California had a pattern of landholding that was different from the pattern of landholding in the rest of the nation. California farms were on average much bigger than farms in other parts of the country. Farmers in other parts of the country, like the Midwest or the Northeast, farmers on average tended to live on their farms and work their farms, harvest their food. In California, more often than not, farms were owned by absentee landlords, by corporations or by very wealthy people who lived in San Francisco or Los Angeles. That doesn't mean there were no small farmers in California. There certainly were some. It's just on average, California farms tended to be much bigger. So one statistic I think that shows this is that in most of the rest of the country, 70% of farms had farmers who lived on the land and harvested their own crops, and 30% absentee landlords. In California, those proportions were reversed, and 70% of farms were owned by people who did not live on the land or work the land. Right? So you had these very large farms or ranches that were owned by people who didn't live there. They would hire labor contractors who then brought in these vast armies of workers to harvest the crops. And for a long time, the California farmers who were part of the system, the very large farmers, were proud of this. They formed a trade organization, and here's a quote from one of their spokesmen when he was testifying to Congress in 1925. He said, "We're not husbandmen, we're not farmers, we're producing a product to sell." Right? They considered themselves to be industrial farmers. Right? Carrie McWilliams was a very famous California writer who wrote many books about California history in the 30s and 40s. And one of his books was called Factories in the Field. And in Factories in the Field, he talked about these large California farms. He said, ownership is represented not by physical possession of the land, but by ownership of corporate stock. Farm labor, no longer pastoral in character, punches a time clock, works at piece or hourly wage rates, and lives in a shack or company barracks, and lacks all contact with the real owners of the farm factory on which it is employed. Right. So this was a slight exaggeration. He's implying that there's no small farms in California. That's not true. But what he is describing is these very large factory farms in California. What about the workers who were hired to pick this produce? Well, they were very impoverished. California farm workers, even in the 1920s, which was a prosperous period in the rest of the country, were extremely poor. They earned among the lowest wages in the United States. They earned just enough to get rice and beans, feed their families, and then go on to the next job. And they were migratory. So many of them lived in shacks, or they lived in their cars, or they would sometimes live in grower-provided housing that they would have to pay for. Because the jobs were not desirable, there was obviously very hard physical labor, and they're not getting paid very much money, there were very few native-born Americans who were willing to take these jobs. So for many years in California, there were waves of immigrants who took these jobs. There were Chinese immigrants, and then Japanese immigrants, and then Filipino immigrants. By the 1920s, it's largely Mexican immigrants or Mexican Americans. So that's all before the Great Depression. What happens is that the Great Depression comes, the crash comes in 1929, the Depression is really starting in 1930, 31, and things get much worse. They get much worse in California, but they get worse all over the nation. And this is a picture of the Dust Bowl, of course, as I'm sure many of you recognize. This was an ecological catastrophe in the southwestern United States, centered on Oklahoma, but going far beyond Oklahoma, where there was not enough moisture to keep the soil on the ground. And so this drought compounded the problems caused by the economic depression, and there were these huge billowing clouds of dust that would blow around. And the people who were farming in this area often would lose their farms. They lost their farms because of the falling crop prices, because of the general depression, and because of the dust. And so their lives in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas were getting much worse. The whole economy starts to fall apart in the early 1930s. A lot of people who previously never would have considered doing farm work in California decide to come out here and take those jobs. A lot of people who were born in the United States, who have deep roots in the United States, come out to California and compete with the immigrants for these jobs. And they are, of course, called Okies, which is a derogatory term at the time, although they reclaim it later and say they're proud to be Okies. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this picture of that Dorothea Lange took, a migrant mother. This is the plight of many native-born white Americans, also African Americans, who come out to California to try and harvest the crops. Now, why are they coming if things are bad in California too? Well, a lot of them, not all of these farmers who have lost their farms in the Southwest come to California. Some of them go to factories in urban areas. But a lot of them, they're farmers. They want to continue being farmers. And so they think, well, I'll come out to California, and even though I won't get paid very much, at least I'll still be working the land. So they come out in 1932, 33. And as they come, there's more and more competition for these jobs. If there's so many laborers and the wage rates continue to fall, then what do workers typically do if their conditions are getting worse and their wages are falling? Well, what workers often do in those circumstances would be to form a union. But it was very difficult to form a union in the California fields in the 1930s, in part because the main union organization in the United States at the time was the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And the AFL decided not to help farm workers in California to form a union. This is because it was just so difficult. First of all, the farm workers earn hardly any money, so they can't pay union dues. So it means that the AFL would have to do this just strictly out of charity. The other union members in the AFL would have to subsidize the farm workers. Also, it's very unpleasant to be a union organizer in the fields in California. You know, you have to live in a shack, you have to live in a ditch. And it's really hard because if you organize a group of workers who are, say, picking cotton, and you succeed in getting them in a union, then the next thing you know, they've moved on to citrus, right? And you have to follow them, and it's a bunch of different workers, and you have to start all over again. And there are still a lot of immigrants in the California fields, along with the Okies, and this means there's all kinds of languages that are being spoken, and it's very hard for them to organize. And finally, sometimes the growers use a lot of violence to stop the unionization. And there are people beating the workers on the picket lines. And so this is a quote, it appeared in the New York Times, about why there was no union organization in the California fields, where an AFL organizer told the reporter, only fanatics are willing to live in shacks or tents and gets their heads broken in the interest of migratory laborers. Right. So the AFL, the traditional union, was not willing to organize the farm workers. But there were some fanatics who were. And that's the people that I want to talk about today. In the 1930s, the Communist Party of the USA reached its peak strength. There were about 100,000 dues-paying, card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the United States in the 1930s. It's about 100,000 who were properly in the party, and another million who were close to the party but didn't actually pay dues. And you can imagine that the reason that the communists are popular in this decade is that it's the Depression, and if there's ever a time in American history when it seems like capitalism doesn't work, that would be it, right? So you have these people who are disillusioned with capitalism, who are joining the Communist Party. And the communists at that time, the Communist Party, decided that it would be useful to have organizers to go into the poorest areas of the United States and organize the workers. And so that's what they decided to do in California, was actually to start a union for farm workers. And the headquarters of the Farm Worker Union was in Sacramento. So this is a picture of a May Day parade that the Communist Party put on. Their office was on I Street, about 9th and I. And here they are marching down in downtown Sacramento. Here's another picture. Again, they're from the Sacramento Bee of a communist march in downtown Sacramento. This is in 1934. Very close to their headquarters was a place called Plaza Park at the time. It's about 9th and I in downtown Sacramento. And this is what they used as their recruiting ground. They would go to Plaza Park and they would literally stand on soapboxes and give their communist speeches and try and recruit members that way. And they used this so often that Sacramento, there were many people in Sacramento who were angry about this. This is a letter to the editor of the Sacramento Union, is complaining about how revolution is being fomented in Plaza Park, so that Sacramento actually passed an ordinance that said people couldn't give political speeches in Plaza Park anymore. All right, so the Farm Worker Union is centered in Sacramento, and I want to talk specifically about the two leaders of the Farm Worker Union. All right, the first one here I want to talk about is this man on the left here looking at the camera, the young man. His name was Pat Chambers. He was in his early 30s at this time. He was born in Ohio, and he had had a lot of really physical jobs. He had worked on a cargo ship, he had unloaded ships, he worked in an oil field, and he had become progressively angrier at the economic system, and he decided in the early 30s to become a communist and to become a communist union organizer. Now I want to be clear here what that meant to be a communist to Pat Chambers. Obviously there are communist texts. There's Marx, there's Engels, there's Lenin that you can read. For people like Pat Chambers, who were just ordinary Americans who joined the Communist Party at that time, they had, a real hazy idea of what communism was. It wasn't like they sat around reading Das Kapital in the firelight. What they thought communism meant was helping poor people and forming unions, getting poor people more money. And so that's what communism meant to Chambers, so he joined the party and became a union organizer for them. Great. And the other person that I want to talk about is the woman here in this picture. This is kind of a spoiler alert because the picture comes from later. This is when she's on trial in Sacramento. Her name was Caroline Decker, and she was born in Georgia. She was just 21 years old in 1933 when she started leading major strikes in California. She had grown up in a quite conservative Republican household. Her father was a small businessman. He owned a tire store, but she rebelled. And as early as 16, she had joined the Communist Party and was going out and organizing unions for them. She worked for a long time in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the coal mines. So then she met the man who's on the extreme left here. His name was Jack Warnick. He was also a communist. They got married, and they decided to come out to California and organize farm workers. And now we come in this story to 1933, which was the beginning of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. All right, so here's a picture of Roosevelt throwing out a first pitch. Now, when Roosevelt, he was elected in the election of 1932, and he became president in 1933, he had a very ambitious reform program, which Congress quickly passed. There were many parts to it. They were going off the gold standard, repeal of prohibition, securities regulation, bank deposit insurance, the Civilian Conservation Corps. The parts that are really important here for this story today are, first of all, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which attempted to deal with falling farm prices by setting up a program where farmers could get checks from the federal government in return for reducing their production. So the idea was if the supply falls, then the price will go up, plus the farmers would get the check. It was a voluntary program. It was very popular with farmers, including the big growers in California, who were very excited to get their subsidy checks. And at that point, were big supporters of Franklin Roosevelt when he was sending them checks. Another part of the New Deal that was very well supported by the big growers in California were the public works, the infrastructure. The New Deal in California built a lot of roads and also dams and irrigation canals so that the growers could get subsidized water brought to their farms, right? So they were also very big on the public works part of the New Deal, especially as it benefited farmers. This part was not something that most employers were very fond of. The National Industrial Recovery Act had many parts to it, but it had one section that was designed to protect the right to join a union. And this is exactly what it said here. Employees have the right to organize and bargain collectively, shall be free from interference by employers, and they have the right to collective bargaining. So in brief, it said that the federal government recognizes the right to join a union. The federal government will support you if you want to join a union. Employers have to recognize a union if a majority of workers want to form them, have to bargain in good faith with the union. Right? This is part of the National Industrial Recovery Act. And it sparks this wave of union organization across the United States in all kinds of industries. Hundreds of thousands of workers begin to demand their right to join a union. All right. It does not say anything about farm workers. This is the National Industrial Recovery Act. And actually, it does not apply to farm workers. It just applies to industrial workers. The owners of a lot of farmland in California and in the Southeast lobbied the federal government and said, you can't let farm workers be part of this because of the difficulty of having a strike during harvest time. Like if the workers went on strike during harvest, we would lose all of our crops. We can't do that, so don't let this law apply to them. So they were exempted. However, the farm workers didn't know that. And so they heard that Franklin Roosevelt wants you to join a union. Franklin Roosevelt protects your right to join a union. And so up and down California, farm workers began demanding the right to join a union, began insisting that their employers, the farm owners, had to recognize their unions and pay them more. The employers, the farmers, the growers said, no, you don't have that right. I'm not going to recognize that right. And so the result was this massive agricultural strike in California, the biggest agricultural strike in American history. 50,000 farm workers refused to pick the crops. Here is a quote from a telegram that a Labor Department official in California sent back to Washington. He was very upset that the farm workers didn't seem to realize that these protections didn't apply to them. He said they are union mad and have been led to believe that the government upholds them in their stand. So there were these massive strikes throughout the California fields. The biggest one was in the Central Valley in the cotton area. This is in the fall of 1933. And this is the strike that will lead the way to the trial. Okay. The strike began spontaneously. Cotton pickers in the Central Valley, about 20,000 of them in an area that was about 100 miles long up and down the Central Valley, decided they weren't going to pick cotton unless their wages were raised. They were earning considerably less than the national minimum wage that had been established by the National Industrial Recovery Act. And so they said, you have to pay us more or we won't pick the cotton. So this was a spontaneous strike. It wasn't started by a union, but as soon as Pat Chambers and Caroline Decker heard about it, they went to the Central Valley, that came down from Sacramento, to organize the workers, to help them form leadership, write flyers, come up with lists of demands. And there's actually, I have about 45 seconds of footage here of a movie that was shot, a silent movie that gives you an idea of what this would have looked like. This is Pat Chambers talking to the farm workers in one of these Central Valley towns. So you can see what all of the men, of course, are wearing hats in those days. And here is Caroline Decker. And we don't know exactly why she became a communist, but I think part of it might have had to do with the fact that the Communist Party did allow these opportunities for women to have these leadership positions. Can you imagine you're 21 years old in 1933? And this is a platform for you. This party gives you the opportunity to lead the strike and to give these speeches. Right? All right, so Chambers and Decker went down to the Central Valley towns and started to organize the workers. All right, the threat of violence was very much present. Chambers and Decker were very worried about it. The way the strike worked was that the cotton pickers left the fields, and then they set up what were in effect picket lines on the highways, and the growers would then bring in strike breakers to pick the cotton, and the striking workers would stand on the roads and yell into the fields, you know, join us, stop working. All right, so here's a picture of them. They're using bugles, and they're yelling and trying to encourage the strike breakers to come join their strike. Sometimes these pickets were attacked by growers and their representatives, by vigilantes. The growers, of course, pushed all of the strikers off of their land, said you can't live in company housing if they provided that, but also you can't camp on my land. So Chambers and Decker helped the strikers to organize a tent city outside the city of Corcoran in the Central Valley. There were 5,000 strikers who lived there. And the land was provided by a small farmer. A lot of the smaller farmers were supportive of the strike because they believed that when the big growers cut the wages so dramatically, that undervalued their labor as well. And so they were supportive of the strike. They provided the land for the tent cities. It went on for a couple of weeks. They organized, kitchens and meals and cultural events, as well as the strike education. Workers were increasingly worried that the growers were going to start assaulting them and perhaps even killing them. And they wanted to carry guns to protect themselves from the growers and the vigilantes. Here's a sign where they're saying that the rich farmers should be disarmed, or if not, then they should be allowed to carry their own guns. Interestingly, it was the communists who said, no, don't carry guns, don't do anything that might possibly provoke violence, because first of all, they were worried about people getting killed, and if the workers start shooting, then the growers are really going to shoot a lot more people. But also, they didn't want the strike discredited. They said, if you start shooting, even if after you've been shot at, you're going to lose public support. So it was Chambers and Decker who were all the time saying, no, don't carry guns. Don't do anything. Essentially it was like the civil rights movement later, with the civil disobedience. Engage in the strike, but don't do anything violent. However, after 2 weeks, the vigilantes did strike. There's a little town in the Central Valley called Pixley, and Pat Chambers was giving a talk there one day, probably looked a lot like the one you just saw in the film, and there were about 500 workers listening to him, and suddenly this whole caravan of trucks pulled up and surrounded the crowd, and they started shooting at the people. And here's a picture from one of the San Francisco newspapers of a man who had been injured, and 2 men were killed. One was a striker, and one was actually a representative of the Mexican government who had come on a fact-finding mission, because there were some Mexican nationals among the strikers. That was in Pixley. The same day, about 20 miles away, there was another shooting at a strike meeting where another man was killed. All right, so all of this was reported by California newspapers, and so people in the cities knew that the strike had become violent and workers were now dying. And so there began to be calls for what is the government going to do, right? And it was unclear at first because, as I say, the national law about unions had left out farm workers. So the federal government didn't really have any responsibility, but was it going to allow this violence against workers to continue? They decided not, that they would not allow the violence to continue. And the man who took charge was this guy. His name was George Creel. He was a player in California politics. He would later run for governor. He had been a chief of propaganda for the US government during World War I. He'd been a journalist. Anyway, his role at this point in 1933 was he was the head of the National Recovery Administration in California. So he was like this New Deal official. And so he said, I'm in charge of recovery. If the cotton's not getting picked and the workers are getting shot, obviously the economy can't recover. So I believe I have jurisdiction. So he left San Francisco, went to the strike, and said, I'm going to mediate this. I'm going to come up with a solution. I'm going to stop the killing and get the cotton picked. And so then he reached out to the California state government, which was controlled by Republicans, but they also wanted the strike to stop. So it was this bipartisan federal state effort to send this commission down to the heart of the strike. They had 2 days of hearings. These commissioners listened to the workers complain, to the growers talk about what they could pay, and the commission then came up with a solution and said, okay, growers, you say you can only pay 60 cents for every 100 pounds of cotton. The workers want $1. You're going to pay them 75 cents. So it was closer to what the growers were offering than what the workers wanted, but it still was a considerable expense for the growers. So the growers said, no, we're not going to do that. Go away. You have no jurisdiction. We'll take care of this ourselves. And Creel went to the union and said, I have this deal. And they said, well, will you recognize the union? And he said, no, you're communist. Are you crazy? We're not going to recognize a communist union. But, do you want this deal? And they agreed to take the deal even without union recognition because it was higher wages for the workers. And so then Creel went back to the growers and said, okay, the workers are willing to accept it. So you're going to accept it, or else you're not going to get your AAA subsidy checks. And they said, what? And he said, it is a privilege. You are getting government money to help the cotton industry recover. You got to share some of that with your workers. And if you're not going to, you're just not going to get those checks in the mail. Well, they were furious, but they finally complied and they got their checks. But they really, really were angry at Creel and by extension Franklin Roosevelt, at the New Deal. They were angry. Here's a sample sentence of what appeared in the Visalia Times-Delta, which was a very pro-grower newspaper. It says, by all that is fair and just, have the American farmers no rights over communists and aliens. Right? They believed that the federal government was supporting, this alien philosophy in Mexican farm workers, although there were many different nationalities. But they were siding not with Americans. And so this really cemented their belief that even though the New Deal was giving them subsidy checks and bringing them water, that ultimately it was, an enemy to the growers. Some of the largest growers, these are mostly corporate farmers, got together and formed a group called the Associated Farmers. So this is their response. Their idea is we're going to organize, just as the workers have organized, and we're going to make sure this never happens again. We're going to make sure we never get to the point where we have this prolonged kind of agricultural strike. And so they made this declaration of law and order and various principles. But they did several things. First of all, they started organizing politically to make sure that their friends would be in office so that they wouldn't have this kind of interference anymore that they perceived from the New Dealers. They set up a surveillance system. It was a very sophisticated system of informers. It involved hundreds of informers. They collected information on people who were union activists or outspoken in favor of the union. They came up with index cards. They shared the index cards with each other, the reports, so to make sure that they would not hire union activists in the future. And then to get at the people at the top, they decided what we're going to do is figure out a way to get them in prison so that the union leadership is not going to be a threat anymore. So this was the fall of 1933 when this happened. It's early 1934 when they began to get organized. And in the time between the winter of 34, when the Associated Farmers forms, and the summer of 1934, when they succeed in getting the farm worker union leaders arrested, is a very dramatic time in California history. First of all, let's talk about what Chambers and Decker do after the cotton strike is over. They decide that they are in danger, and they're not crazy in thinking that. There's a lot of lynchings in California at that time, and not just racially motivated lynchings, but lynchings of accused criminals. There are 2 people that are taken out of the San Jose jail and hanged in the park in the center of San Jose in 1933 because of the heinousness of their crime. They're just taken, or their supposed crime. They were never put on trial. There's also a lot of lynchings of labor organizers in California. And so they are worried that they're going to get lynched. And so there are several very prominent supporters of the Farm Worker Union organization and the leaders that decide, we're going to take them in for a few months and keep them safe. And a lot of these supporters live in the Monterey Carmel area. There are some writers, poets, playwrights, artists who invite Chambers and Decker and other union leaders to come live with them in the winter of 1934. There are actors there. Caroline Decker learns to tap dance from James Cagney at some of these parties. It sounds like they had a lot of really fun parties. And one of the people who's part of the scene is John Steinbeck, who at that time is not John Steinbeck. He's not known. He's very early in his career. But he interviewed the union leaders who were there, particularly Chambers, took extensive notes, and is going to use this, everything he learns in his future writings. However, Chambers and Decker can't hide out forever, so they do go back to Sacramento in the summer. Meanwhile, throughout California, there's increasing fear of a possible communist revolution. In San Francisco, there's a big waterfront strike that turns into a longshoreman strike that then turns into a general strike, which means the whole city is shut down for several days. There are pitched battles in the streets. The police kills 2 strikers. This prolongs the general strike. And throughout California, there are a lot of people who are beginning to worry that this is a prelude to revolution, that the general strike is a sign of revolution to come. Now, the governor quelled that strike, ended it, the general strike, by sending in the National Guard. But still, people are very afraid that communists were behind the general strike, and if communists continue to be allowed in California, they're going to foment a revolution. So here's a political cartoon at the time showing this desire by many Californians to get rid of the Reds. Okay, so that's the backdrop to the Associated Farmers going to the Sacramento Police Department and saying, you have a whole bunch of communist leaders right here on I Street. And really, they should be put in jail. So the police had a raid on the Farm Worker Union headquarters one night. Here is a picture from the Bee of a police officer looking at the address as he goes in. They looked for contraband. They found a lot of signs like this. And apparently, this picture would lead you to believe that they were kind of rough with the communists they found inside the building. They arrested a few dozen communists in Sacramento and sent them to jail on the charge of vagrancy. Vagrancy was like an all-purpose charge in the 1930s. where police could pick you up and say, I don't think that you have a fixed address, you're going to jail for vagrancy. Now, you wouldn't stay in jail very long, but maybe 30 days. And it was a way they could quickly deal with people. While they were in jail for vagrancy, the district attorney decided to try and come up with some charges that would put these communists away for a longer time. And that's when he decided to use the 1919 criminal syndicalism law, which outlawed membership in any group that called for unlawful acts of force and violence as a means of accomplishing a change in industrial ownership or control or affecting any political change. So that means if you belong to the Communist Party, you can be sent away for up to 10 years. And the trial began in early 1935. So here's a picture of everyone who was initially on trial. They had 19 defendants at the beginning, and then this was whittled down to 14 as people separated their cases. So it's a conspiracy trial of 14 people ultimately, saying that they conspired to commit criminal syndicalism. They worked with each other to advocate for the overthrow of capitalism or the overthrow of the government. Now, the trial was heavily covered by the media. Here's a picture of the courthouse steps in Sacramento with people lining up to get inside. There was a great deal of excitement about it. It was a little bit of a tricky charge for the prosecutors because they had to show that these union leaders not only belonged to the Communist Party, but were advocating for violence. And this was difficult to show because they had not advocated for violence. So they had to just sort of make the connection. Well, if they're in the Communist Party, they therefore are advocating violence. The Sacramento DA was the one who brought the charges. He was actually voted out of office in November, and the new DA refused to pursue the case. But the state government so wanted to put the communist leaders away that they appointed a special prosecutor in Sacramento to try the case. The stars of the trial were, for the defense, Caroline Decker, who was a great orator, and she represented herself. She also had lawyers with her. There's a lawyer in the center of the table there. The American Civil Liberties Union sent people to help them. The Communist Party did not. It's interesting, by this point, this is early 1935, and the Communist Party had moved to a new strategy. They were really worried about the rise of Hitler in Germany, so they started advocating for what was called the Popular Front, which meant working with liberals, working within existing unions. And so they said, you know, actually we don't want a communist farm worker union anymore, and we don't support the people that were on trial. So they didn't give them so Chambers and Decker were like abandoned by the Communist Party, though they did have help from the ACLU. All right, so Decker was representing herself, gave a lot of, very passionate speeches. And interestingly, the tack she decided to take was to defend her right to be a communist on the grounds of the First Amendment. Also, there was a lot of attention in the press to the people who had supported her in Carmel and Monterey in the previous winter. And so there's sort of a little mini Red Scare as the press identifies people like James Cagney, Langston Hughes, Lincoln Steffens, who had been supportive of them and saying, if these people are on trial for criminal syndicalism, therefore their supporters must also be un-American. Right, so Caroline Decker was chosen by the defendants to give the closing remarks. And so this is how she presented it. She said, if you vote for an acquittal, you're not voting for communism. You're voting for the right of the American people to say what they please. You are a jury that will make history. So she's saying, if you vote for us, then you are favoring freedom of speech. The prosecutor took another strategy, He took out a flag and actually waved it around and said, I ask you to think of this flag in your jury room. I ask you to think of what it stands for, and I'm going to ask you to bring in a vote for that flag, for the good old USA, for my country 'tis of thee, for the Star-Spangled Banner, for my own United States, and God will bless you. Right? So it's about Americanism versus un-Americanism. Right? And he carried the day, at least for 8 of them. So 6 of them were acquitted, 8 were convicted, including Chambers and Decker. They faced many years in prison. The women were sent to Tehachapi State Prison. The Chambers and the men were sent to San Quentin. They ended up actually only serving a few years. Decker was the first one out. She was released on good behavior because she had done so much to help the prison. She taught piano lessons to the other prisoners, and was generally very well liked by the prisoners and by the prison matrons. And so they arranged for her to get out even before her appeal was successful. And her appeal ultimately was successful, and all the rest were released after about 3 years in prison. The grounds for the appeal was essentially a technicality, where the court was like, well, how did 8 get convicted and 6 get acquitted when there's no difference between the 2 groups? It doesn't make any sense. So they threw out the 8 convictions. Decker and Chambers, when they left, had no interest in doing anything with the Communist Party anymore because of the way they had felt abandoned. Decker moved to San Francisco, started working in the office of her appellate lawyer, got divorced from her husband, and then later married her appellate lawyer. And they moved to Marin. She had 4 kids and lived the rest of her life as a suburban mom, although one who was, would have fundraisers for radical causes, but she was never again a labor activist. Chambers moved to Los Angeles, where he became a carpenter and tried to keep a very low profile. I think both of them, by this point, were probably pretty traumatized. The violence in the prison and all of the stress, and they just wanted to spend the rest of their lives without that kind of drama. So let's talk about how this was remembered. One of the major chroniclers of this period in California history was Steinbeck, who, as I said, had met Decker and Chambers and had actually extensively interviewed Chambers. Steinbeck would go on to write a novel called In Dubious Battle, which is basically the story of the cotton strike. He just changed the cotton to apples. But he changed a lot of things, actually. He himself was anti-communist. He was a liberal, but he was very anti-communist. And so he decided in writing this story that he was going to make the growers the villains. He very much believed that they were villains, but also the communists were another set of villains. And it was the ordinary working men who were the heroes of the story. So even though he had gotten his information from Chambers, he decided to tell a story of manipulative communist union leaders and evil, selfish growers. He also, even though he had met Decker and he knew that many women were involved, had almost no women in the story. He made it all about men versus men. And he also made everyone white, so there's no Mexicans in the story. So he told a distinctive version. It was very popular. It sold a lot of copies. It made, got a lot of attention, but it was definitely fictionalized. And then, of course, a few years later, he would write The Grapes of Wrath, which was a much bigger success and brought a lot of national attention to the plight of farm workers in California, and helped pressure the federal government to open farm worker housing centers throughout California. The federal government never did recognize the right of farm workers to join a union, but it did provide migrant housing centers, some of which still exist in California. And now let me talk a little bit about the rest of California farm worker organizing history. So once Chambers and Deckers and their 6 colleagues went to prison. That was the end of that union and that union organizing drive. There was then a period of several years in California where there was no farm worker union organizing. The Congress of Industrial Organizations did make one attempt to form a union in the late 30s, but that was met with a lot of violence and they gave up. And then there were no further attempts until the 1960s. And that's when Cesar Chavez decided to try to start a farm worker union in California. Now, Chavez read a lot of history. He knew very well the story of the 1930 strikes, and he decided, I think quite rightly, that one of the reasons that they had failed is that they were communist, and they had been discredited and imprisoned because of their communist beliefs. And so he was going to be sure not to have any affiliations with communism. He also very strategically presented his movement not only as a labor movement, but as a civil rights movement. And thus got a lot of support from liberals and church groups throughout California. And so he was organizing his big grape strike in Delano in 1965. He was in the midst of organizing for it. There was a lot of press attention on the strike and the grape boycott. When he got he had a visitor arrived at the Delano headquarters, and his secretary came back to him in his office and said, "There's this old man out here. He says he used to organize farm workers in California. You know, do you have time to talk to him?" And Chavez said, "No, you know, I'm so busy. I don't have time to talk to some old guy." What was his name? And she said, I think she said his name. He said his name was Pat Chambers. And Chavez said, "What? Pat Chambers? I know Pat Chambers. I have heard of him. Bring him in." And so then they proceeded to have a couple of hours of conversation in which Chavez, pumped him for information about everything that had happened to him in the 30s. And they ended the conversation by Chavez saying to Chambers, "What I don't understand is I've been doing this for months now. Why is it only now that you have come up to signal your support?" And Chambers said, "I didn't want to ruin it for you. I didn't want to have you be discredited by associations with communism." So Chavez continued his organizing drive, did set up the United Farm Workers. In 1975, California passed a law that recognized the right to join a union for farm workers as well as industrial workers. And Chavez, when he died in the 1990s, was honored in Sacramento. And Plaza Park, the park on I Street where the communists used to go and stand on their soapboxes and harangue people about joining a union, that was renamed Cesar Chavez Plaza.